By the time Eleanor Brooks opened the envelope with a storage auction flyer, she had almost stopped expecting life to hand her anything new. The paper lay on her kitchen table between a chipped mug and a bottle of prescription pills, its corners still stiff, the ink too dark to belong to anything old or familiar. Public auction, it said in large block letters, followed by a list of unit numbers and a date circled in red. She read it twice before she realized her hands were trembling. Not from age, though 70 was not kind to joints, but from the faint, unwelcome feeling that something out there was moving toward her after years in which everything important had seemed to move away. Eleanor's house was quiet in the way homes become when they have lost a person whose footsteps once gave them rhythm. Her husband, Richard, had been gone for 5 years now. He had been an archaeologist in the modest, realistic sense of the word. University digs, museum contracts, long days in the sun cataloging pottery shards and coins that would never appear in glossy magazines but mattered deeply to the few who understood them. He brought home little money and less free time, but when he spoke about layers of earth and the stories buried in them, his eyes had a light that made their small living room feel like a wider world. When he died, suddenly, a phrase doctors like to use when heart's betrayal is too quick to prepare for, the house lost more than his voice. It lost direction. After the funeral, life narrowed. Eleanor kept to routines. Tea at 6, news at 7, one phone call a week from her daughter, if they were on speaking terms that month. There had been a falling out years before, the kind that starts with something specific, sharp and loud, and then dulls into a long ache made of pride, misunderstanding, and the busy cruelty of modern schedules. Her daughter thought Richard had chosen his work over his family. Eleanor knew it wasn't that simple, but knowing and explaining are different skills, and somewhere between hospital visits and estate papers, the right words had slipped away. Now the calls were polite, shallow exchanges about weather and traffic, never about the wide gap between "how are you" and "I miss you." Money had become a quiet pressure, not a crisis, but a steady squeeze. The house was nearly paid off, the old sedan still running, the pantry never truly empty. Yet there was nothing extra, not for travel, not for repairs that went beyond what a careful hand and a roll of tape could manage, not for the little indulgences she sometimes saw in store windows and allowed herself to want only for the length of a red light. She watched her neighbors replace roofs and cars, watched her own porch paint peel a little more each winter, and told herself this, too, was just the kind of weather. The idea of storage units entered her life the way small revolutions often do, as background noise. On evenings when sleep would not come, she watched those programs where people bid on abandoned lockers, rolling up metal doors to reveal mountains of forgotten belongings. Sometimes they found nothing but stained mattresses and broken toys. Other times, they uncovered boxes of collectibles, jewelry, even cash hidden in coat linings. Eleanor watched the way the bidders' faces changed when luck tilted their way, cautious, tired eyes suddenly bright with possibility, and felt a strange mix of envy and amusement. She would never do something like that. She told herself it was risky, and she had never been a gambler. Richard had been the one who chased mysteries. She had merely made sure his socks were dry and his notes in order when he came home. Then, one Sunday after church, an old friend from the choir mentioned in passing that she and her husband had rented a storage unit while renovating. You wouldn't believe the things people leave behind, the woman said as they stood in the parking lot, the wind tugging at their coats. The manager told us someone found a box of war medals last year. Another man found a set of old maps that turned out to be valuable. There's even a waiting list for the auctions now. Eleanor smiled politely, but the comment settled into her like a seed. On the drive home, the line repeated in her mind. The things people leave behind. 2 days later at the pharmacy, she bumped into a retired detective she knew from Richard's university days. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, the small talk of people who share a past but not a present. And he mentioned, almost offhand, that he had consulted on a strange case involving a storage unit. Was supposed to be routine, he said. Unpaid rent, auction scheduled. Then someone finds something they shouldn't have. Evidence from an old case, tucked away and forgotten. Took us months to sort out what was junk and what was proof. He shook his head, half troubled, half impressed. You'd be surprised what ends up in those places. By the time Eleanor drove home that afternoon, The coincidence had grown too large to ignore. 2 conversations in 3 days about storage units. Layered on top of all those late-night shows she pretended not to take seriously. She was not a superstitious woman by nature, but years with Richard had taught her to respect patterns. He used to say that sometimes life clears its throat before it speaks plainly. Sitting at her small kitchen table, she looked at the envelope of the auction flyer and felt that something, somewhere, was trying to speak. The envelope itself had arrived the previous week, tucked between a grocery circular and a dentist reminder. Its return addressed a storage facility across town she didn't recognize. At first, she thought it was an advertisement. Only when she opened it did she see that it was addressed specifically to estate of Richard Brooks, care of Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. The phrase estate still felt foreign and formal, as if it belonged in someone else's story. Inside, a brief note explained that the facility was updating its records. A unit once rented in Richard's name had been closed years ago, but as a courtesy, they were including information about an upcoming public auction in case she wished to attend or inquire. Below the note, a printed sheet listed unit numbers scheduled for auction, with 1, Unit 12B, circled in blue ink, though there was no explanation why. For a long time, she had set the envelope aside, uncertain what to make of it. Richard had never mentioned a storage unit. Their finances had been tight enough that she could not imagine him secretly paying rent on extra space. And yet, the paperwork looked official, the dates matching the years when he had traveled more frequently for work, often gone for weeks at a time. It was possible, she admitted, that he had rented the unit temporarily and forgotten to mention it in the rush of flights and deadlines. One evening, curiosity pushed her into action. She walked slowly to the small desk in the corner of her living room, opened the top drawer, and took out the worn leather notebook where she had kept copies of all the important things after Richard died: bank statements, insurance forms, the neatly folded where they had drafted together when he turned 60. She flipped through the pages until she found the section with his handwriting. Thin but steady even in illness. The will contained the usual language about assets and belongings, but at the bottom of one page, in a smaller script, was a note she had never fully understood. Personal collection secured. H knows details. At the time, H had meant nothing. Now, with the envelope on the table and the retired detective's words still echoing, the initial glowed on the paper like a tiny, patient signal. H could only be Henry, Richard's closest friend since boyhood. Henry had been at the hospital near the end, quiet and present in a way that required no explanation. After the funeral, he had promised Eleanor he would take care of the loose ends, a phrase that had seemed practical then. In the years since, health problems of his own had kept him mostly homebound. Their contact reduced to rare holiday cards and occasional voicemail when he remembered to update her about a new medication or a doctor's visit gone well. They had not spoken about Richard's personal collection at all. The longer Eleanor stared at the note, the more the space between its lines seemed to widen. If Richard had trusted Henry with something, it was not a box of old socks. It would have been important, organized, and wrapped, like everything he cared about, in the careful logic of someone who believed that history could only be saved if it was properly labeled and stored. The thought made her chest tighten with a mixture of grief and a very old, very familiar anticipation. She had not felt since her husband returned from his trips with stories and small, heavy objects wrapped in cloth. That night, sleep did not come. She sat in her recliner with the television on low, watching images of strangers rolling up storage doors on some late rerun of a show she had seen too many times. The host was animated, urging viewers to subscribe, and share their own stories of unexpected finds. His enthusiasm almost comical. Eleanor smiled in spite of herself, thinking how strange it was that people loved watching other people open doors. Maybe, she thought, it was because everyone hoped that somewhere, behind some forgotten lock, there waited a version of their own life they had not yet ruined or wasted. In the morning, before she could talk herself out of it, she called the number printed on the auction flyer. The voice on the other end was brisk but kind, confirming the date and time, explaining the rules in simple terms. She could attend, register as a bidder if she wished, and any unit she won would need to be cleared within 48 hours unless she arranged to rent herself. When she asked, trying to sound casual, whether Unit 12B had any special notes attached. The clerk hesitated only a second before saying, "Just that it's been paid up for longer than most. The renter passed away, and the account was held open by a friend for a while. Then the payment stopped. Happens more than you'd think." After she hung up, Eleanor sat very still, the phone heavy in her lap. A friend keeping a unit open after a renter died. An initial H next to a line about a personal collection. A circled number on a list sent as a courtesy. It all could have been coincidence. Or it could have been the last echo of her husband's planning, finally reaching her through layers of delay and distraction. She looked at the calendar, at the date of the auction, at the space between now and then. On the morning of the sale, under a pale sky that promised neither rain nor sun, Eleanor found herself standing in front of a row of blue storage doors, a bidder's number in her pocket, her heart beating faster than it had any right to at her age. The auctioneer's voice moved up and down the line, opening and closing units that contained other people's stories. She barely saw them. Her gaze stayed fixed on one door halfway down the row, 12B, the paint slightly more faded than the rest, as if it had been standing there a little longer, waiting for someone who kept being late. The morning of the auction arrived with the kind of crisp quiet that settles over a town before anything decisive happens, and Eleanor felt its weight the moment she stepped out of her car. She remained near the edge of the parking lot for a moment, steadying herself, taking in the rows of storage doors stretching across the property like a library of forgotten stories. Men and women of all ages gathered in clusters, some carrying clipboards, others were an expression of people who had done this 100 times. Eleanor stood apart, clutching her bidder card tighter than necessary, feeling simultaneously foolish for being here and strangely guided, as though the events of the past days had been arranged specifically to push her toward this moment. The auctioneer's voice rolled across the lot in a steady rhythm, and with each unit sold, she felt anticipation tightening in her chest, knowing Unit 12B waited near the end of the row. When the crowd finally approached the unit, Eleanor drifted toward the front, though she kept her head modestly lowered, not wanting to draw attention. The auctioneer lifted the lock with practiced ease, his fingers tapping the metal like an impatient clock. Her heart beat harder when she saw the blue chalk mark on the door handle, the very mark she had noticed on the website the night before. It felt like a breadcrumb and a trail meant only for her. Two men near the front whispered about the unit, something about it having been rented for years by the same person, someone who rarely showed up in daylight and who always paid in cash. Eleanor tried to ignore their tone, but their words slid under her skin, layering tension atop her already tremulous nerves. Still, she stood her ground, knowing she hadn't come all this way to let speculation sway her. When the door finally rolled upward, the crowd leaned in, expecting to catch a quick glimpse of value before the bidding started. But the unit revealed nothing. A thick tarp hung from the ceiling like a curtain, blocking nearly everything behind it. On the concrete floor sat only a single wooden crate, pushed slightly to the side, just enough to hint that someone had rearranged things recently. The tarp didn't sway, didn't reveal silhouettes, didn't offer even a whisper what lay behind it. And yet, the emptiness in front made the hidden space feel larger, heavier, almost intentionally concealed. Eleanor felt something stir in her chest, an intuition that whatever was behind that curtain was not random at all. The auctioneer gave his usual warnings, but even he paused a little longer than necessary, as though trying to interpret the unusual arrangement himself. When the bidding began, Eleanor lifted her card cautiously, unsure how far she was willing to go. She hadn't come today expecting to win. She had come because she felt compelled to show up. But the moment she raised her card, a man at the far side stepped forward, his coat collar pulled high, his expression unreadable. He bid confidently, as though he had been waiting specifically for this unit. Eleanor hesitated, but another hand rose behind her, belonging to a middle-aged woman with a determined stare. 3 bidders now. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. She had only budgeted enough for a modest bid, yet something inside urged her to keep her card raised. The man in the coat countered every offer with a precision that made the crowd murmur. Eleanor sensed a deeper motive in him, something beyond simple profit, and that only sharpened the unshakable feeling that she was meant to be here. As the numbers climbed, Eleanor considered stepping back. She wasn't wealthy, and she certainly wasn't reckless. But there was something about the way the tarp hung motionless, something about the faint smell of cedar drifting from beneath it, something about the quiet twist in her heart urging her to keep going. The woman behind her dropped out first, shaking her head in resignation. Only Eleanor and the man remained. He raised his card once more, confidently, almost impatiently. The auctioneer called for Eleanor's response, and for a moment she lowered her hand, thinking the moment had passed her by, that whatever this was, whatever her husband might have intended years ago, maybe she wasn't meant to reach after all. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as the auctioneer began to declare the man the winner, the man lowered his own card with a suddenness that startled even him. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't reassessment. It was as though he had received a signal she couldn't see, a cue only he understood. He stepped back into the crowd, disappearing behind taller bidders, leaving Eleanor standing alone with her card still partially raised. The auctioneer blinked, recalculated, then struck his gavel with finality. The unit was hers. A whisper of confusion moved through the crowd, but Eleanor barely heard it. She felt only the thud of her heartbeat, stunned by how close she had come to walking away. As the crowd dispersed, she remained at the threshold, staring into the dimness behind the tarp. The auctioneer handed her the keys, his expression caught between curiosity and concern, but she hardly registered the weight of metal in her palm. She knew she wasn't ready to lift the tarp today, not after everything that had just unfolded. She simply stood there, absorbing the quiet, noticing how the air from inside the unit felt faintly warmer than the outdoor breeze. It was a kind of warmth that suggested the presence of something that had been waiting undisturbed for a long, long time. She locked the door gently and stepped back, realizing she needed time to steady herself before facing whatever story her late husband had left sealed behind that hanging sheet of canvas. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, replaying the moment the man had walked away from the bidding. The scene repeated itself each time she closed her eyes. The tilt of his head, the way his shoulders seemed to drop, as though completing a task. Something about him had felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. His gesture hadn't felt accidental. It felt deliberate, almost protective. As she stirred her tea absent-mindedly, she began to wonder if today had been less about luck and more about design. If her husband's plan, paused for years, had just been set into motion by someone still honoring a promise. And as she blew out the kitchen candle and prepared for bed, she realized one truth echoed louder than all the unanswered questions. Tomorrow, she would return to Unit 12B and finally lift the tarp. When Eleanor returned to the storage facility the next morning, dawn had barely lifted above the rooftops, leaving long stretches of shadow across the rows of units. She walked slowly, clutching the key in her hand, feeling the weight of anticipation settle in her chest like an anchor. The air smelled faintly of cold metal and asphalt warming under the early light. Her steps echoed softly, each one matching the quiet tremor of nervous hope running beneath her ribs. She paused in front of Unit 12B, noticing a faint outline of dust around the keyhole, the kind that suggested the lock hadn't been touched in days, maybe years. For a moment, she hesitated, aware that once she lifted the tarp inside, there would be no turning back. Whatever story her late husband had left sealed away would finally breathe again. When the door rolled upward, the tarp greeted her with the same quiet stillness as before, its heavy canvas draping the floor like a stage curtain hiding an unfinished act. Eleanor stood in the entrance, letting the dim interior adjust her eyes. She took in the wooden crate again, noticing now the faint markings along its edges, scuffs that suggested it had been moved several times, perhaps repositioned deliberately. The silence felt unusually concentrated, as though something inside the unit was holding its breath with her. She reached out and touched the tarp gently, surprised by how cold it felt beneath her fingers. The sensation grounded her, reminding her that fear and courage often began from the same place. With one long exhale, she lifted the tarp. It rose slower than she expected, caught slightly on something before giving way entirely. Behind it, the space expanded into a deeper pocket she hadn't been able to glimpse the day before. A faint scent of cedar drifted forward, warm, familiar, unmistakably connected to her husband, who had loved working with wood in his spare time. For a moment, the smell alone nearly buckled her knees. She steadied herself and stepped inside. The revealed area was filled not with the clutter of abandoned belongings, but with an organized spread of carefully stacked boxes and sealed containers, each labeled in handwriting she recognized instantly. Her husband's handwriting. The letters, slightly slanted, carried that same quiet confidence he'd had when repairing furniture or sketching ideas in his notebook. Eleanor moved deeper into the unit, feeling the texture of the concrete floor beneath her shoes, noticing the absence of dust atop the uppermost box. Whoever had accessed this area last had done so not long ago, which meant the friend her husband had trusted must have been the one maintaining the space. She traced a finger across one of the labels. For E. The simple letter sent a tremor through her chest. The next box read, "Open when ready." Another read, "Memories kept safe." The words softened her breath, pressing against her heart with the weight of love that had outlived the man who wrote them. She took a moment to absorb the truth. He had built this for her, preserved it, protected it, and left it hidden until fate or courage would bring her here. She lifted the lid of the first box carefully, half expecting it to crumble after years of storage. But it held firm. Inside was a collection of letters tied in twine, each envelope marked with a date spanning nearly 2 decades. Beneath them were small objects she recognized, a compass he carried during his early fieldwork, a faded photograph of their first home, a pressed flower she had given him on a spring morning decades earlier. Each item carried a story, and each story carried a question she hadn't known she needed answered. She felt a swell of emotion, equal parts grief and gratitude, rising through her chest as she realized he'd been preparing this long before illness had entered their lives. As she explored deeper into the unit, she discovered a large metal case tucked behind the final stack of boxes. It looked markedly newer than the others, with polished hinges and a reinforced lock. A small tag hung from its handle. "For our future." Her breath caught at the phrasing. It didn't say "your future." It said "our future," as though it believed they were still linked in ways that time couldn't sever. She ran her hand along the cool surface, feeling the weight of something inside shifting faintly. This wasn't sentimental. It was substantial. Something of value. Something he kept hidden deliberately. Perhaps knowing that if he revealed it during his lifetime, she might have insisted he use it for medical care or for helping their daughter, even during the years when their relationship had strained under loss. Before opening the case, Eleanor sat on a low wooden box nearby. Then the air settled around her. She thought of her daughter, the distance that had grown between them not from lack of love, but from mismatched grief. After her husband's passing, both had retreated inward rather than toward each other. Years of unspoken apologies had built walls they could not seem to break. And yet, as Eleanor sat there surrounded by the tangible echoes of her husband's affection and foresight, she felt something loosening inside her, a softening she hadn't known she still possessed. She wondered if perhaps this discovery, this unexpected doorway into the past, might be exactly what her daughter needed too. Not objects or money, but a reminder of the man they had both loved in their own ways. With renewed steadiness, she unclasped the metal case. It opened more smoothly than expected, revealing a neatly arranged bundle of documents, sealed envelopes, and a velvet pouch resting beneath them. She lifted the documents first, scanning the top page. It was a notarized letter in her husband's handwriting, explaining that he had stumbled upon a rare collection during his archaeological work. Items he had safeguarded privately after realizing their value could stir interest from collectors he did not trust. He had placed the collection in a unit, not for secrecy, but for protection, intending it to serve as a gift for her future security. Beneath the letter lay authenticity certificates and appraisals, each confirming the rare worth of what was stored here. When she finally opened the velvet pouch, her breath hitched. Inside were several pieces of ancient jewelry, ornate, beautifully preserved, clearly of significant age, a pendant with detailed engraving, earrings shaped with delicate craftsmanship, a ring inset with a stone she couldn't identify, but which glowed faintly when the light struck it. She felt overwhelmed, not because of their monetary value, but because of what they represented. He had prepared a future for her even when he knew he might not be part of it. Her hands trembled as she held the pieces, humbled by the weight of his care. But the moment that anchored itself deepest in her chest came when she reached the bottom of the case and found a final sealed envelope marked simply for reconciliation. She didn't open it yet. She didn't need to. She understood immediately that it wasn't meant for her alone. It was meant to bridge something broken, to complete a circle of healing her husband had hoped for even in his absence. She rested the envelope gently back inside, her mind racing with the possibilities of what it contained. Letters for her daughter, messages left unfinished, explanations weighted with love. As she closed the case and looked around the unit, at the boxes arranged with intention, at the memories preserved with tenderness, she realized she was standing at the center of a story her husband had written for her long before she knew she would need it. And in that realization, a new question emerged, steady and urgent, carrying the force of a turning tide. She knew now what lay behind the tarp, but what lay inside the final envelope, and how it might change her family forever. Waited for tomorrow, the moment Eleanor lifted the lid. The air inside the storage unit seemed to contract, as if the room itself understood the weight of the secret finally returning to light. The envelope lay atop the neatly folded cloth like a final unspoken thought, cream-colored, perfectly preserved, with her name written in her husband's steady handwriting, the kind she had not seen in nearly 5 years. Her breath hitched, her fingers trembling as she lifted it. The edges were crisp, untouched by time, as though the letter had been placed here yesterday. For a long moment she simply held it, tracing the familiar loops of her name, absorbing the quiet gravity of a moment. Behind her, the metal walls seemed to hold their breath. Even the distant hum of another unit's ventilation felt muffled, respectful, aware. She opened the letter slowly, careful not to tear the paper. The first line landed in her chest with the force of memory awakened. My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, then the plan worked, though likely not in the timing I imagined. She sat down on the edge of a closed wooden crate, the late afternoon light slipping in from the hallway and settling across her shoulders as though urging her to keep reading. Her husband's voice, long gone from the world, unfurled in the simple, thoughtful sentences that followed. He wrote of the illness he had hidden from her for as long as he dared, not from pride, but because he couldn't bear to watch her worry. He wrote of the treasures he had collected across decades, rare geological samples, artifacts from small expeditions, journals of friends now past, each of them meaningful but unshared, locked away while he convinced himself there would always be time to show her later. I was wrong about time, he wrote, and I refused to admit it until it was too late. A delicate ache spread across her chest as she moved deeper into the letter. He admitted the hardest truth, that he had failed their daughter long before illness entered their home, allowing pride and stubbornness to widen a distance that neither of them dared to close. I never meant for you to carry the weight of that silence, he wrote. You were always a peacemaker, the one who held us steady. I should have followed your example. Eleanor paused, her vision blurring as tears gathered, not in a dramatic rush, but in the soft, steady warmth of a wound finally touched with honesty. She realized she had waited years to hear him say these things, years wondering why the man who adored his family had let the fracture remain. The truth, that he had been ashamed, unsure how to reach across a bridge he himself had burned, felt both heartbreaking and strangely liberating. Then she reached a line that made her inhale sharply. Inside this box, you will find a smaller envelope. It is not for you, my love. It is for Olivia. Her fingers paused, the letter lowering to her lap as she looked toward the interior of the chest, as if seeing it for the first time with new meaning. Give it to her when you are ready, the letter continued. I wrote it during the last week I was able to hold a pen. If she chooses to open it, she will understand everything I was too proud, too frightened, too foolish to say. And perhaps she will forgive me. And perhaps she will forgive you, too, for the things you carried in silence. She folded the page against her heart and leaned forward, elbows on her knees, letting the truth settle over her like a tide that took its time. For years, she believed that the distance with her daughter was a slow erosion of affection, something born from simple misunderstanding and stubborn personalities. But the letter revealed a deeper root, something her husband had kept from both of them, choosing to exile himself rather than burden them with his illness, choosing secrecy rather than vulnerability. It wasn't malicious. It was human. It was flawed. It was him. The realization softened her grief in a way she didn't expect, turning sharp pain into something weary but warm, like a bruise finally beginning to fade. She reached into the trunk and lifted the small envelope, white, thin, sealed. On the front, in the same familiar handwriting, 3 words, "For my Olivia." She held it with reverence, as if afraid it might dissolve. For a moment she imagined her daughter reading it. Imagine her expression shifting from skepticism to disbelief to something softer, something like forgiveness. She imagined the possibility, fragile but real, that this little envelope could mend what had been broken for nearly a decade. And for the first time in many months, maybe years, Eleanor felt a faint, insistent pull of hope. Beside the envelopes lay stacks of carefully wrapped bundles. Old expedition journals tied with twine, small sealed containers holding labeled samples of rare stones, a few intricate artifacts she had only ever heard stories about, and along the side, a velvet pouch whose contents clinked softly when she lifted it. She opened it to reveal a small collection of coins, gold, silver, and 2 pieces so old they seemed almost unreal. Each item held the weight of intention. These weren't trophies. They were keepsakes meant for her. Her husband had not been wealthy, not in the financial sense, but the value of these items, some historical, some sentimental, some genuinely rare, was undeniable. She understood then. He had built this storage unit as a final act of care, a puzzle whose solution would give her not only financial stability, but a path back to the family she feared she had lost. She sat for a long time, absorbing the meaning layer behind every choice he had made. The dim light in the unit shifted toward evening, the corridor quieting as workers finished their rounds. She touched the artifacts, read the dates on the journals, held the coins until they warmed in her palms. The unit no longer felt like a random purchase born from loneliness. It felt like a conversation with the past, a moment waiting for her patiently across 5 long years. And somewhere within that realization, a soft certainty took root. She wasn't meant to carry any of this alone. Not the grief, not the reconciliation, not the hope. As she gathered the envelopes and carefully placed them into her bag, a familiar fear crept up, the fear of calling her daughter, of hearing uncertainty or reluctance in her voice. But beneath that fear lay something stronger, a sense of direction. Her husband had spent his final days weaving a bridge for them, and now it was her turn to take the first step across it. She touched the smaller envelope again, feeling its delicate weight. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, it felt possible. She closed the trunk, wiped her eyes, and stood, her posture steadier than when she first entered the unit. The evening air drifted softly down the hallway, brushing past her like a quiet encouragement, and as she reached for the light switch, preparing to leave with everything she had discovered, her phone buzzed unexpectedly in her pocket. A name appeared on the screen, one she hadn't seen light up her phone in far too long. It was Olivia. The sound of Olivia's name glowing on the phone screen hit Eleanor like a soft shock, gentle, unexpected, and strangely perfectly timed, as if the universe itself had decided to push her across the bridge her husband had left behind. Her thumb hovered for a moment, suspended between fear and longing, before she finally answered. The conversation began awkwardly, the pauses wide enough to carry years of unspoken hurt, yet threaded with a tenderness neither of them dared name out loud. Olivia asked if her mother was all right, mentioned that she felt a strange tug that afternoon, the kind of intuition daughters sometimes carry even after distance has numbed familiarity. Eleanor didn't mention the letter. Not yet. Instead, she simply said she would love to see her soon, and to her quiet astonishment, Olivia agreed. When the call ended, Eleanor exhaled, realizing her hands were trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of a door creaking open after being shut for far too long. That evening, the house felt different, brighter, though the lights were unchanged. She set the 2 envelopes on the small wooden table beside her favorite armchair, the place where she had spent countless lonely nights reading old paperbacks or watching muted television just to fill the silence. Now the silence felt meaningful, full, as if the air were rearranging itself around the possibility of a new beginning. She read her husband's letter again, slower this time, absorbing the intention behind every line. Each confession, each tender apology, each admission of fear felt like a thread gently pulling together the frayed edges of her memory. She found herself speaking softly into the stillness. "You should have told us sooner." But there was no bitterness in the words, only the softness of someone who understands the fragility of human imperfection. She slept lightly that night, waking before dawn as though the next day carried its own kind of promise. She spent the morning sorting the artifacts and journals, creating small piles on the dining room table. Items meant to keep, items meant to appraise, items meant to share. She treated each object with reverence, understanding now that none of this was random. Every sample, every relic, every written page her husband had saved reflected years of his quiet devotion to exploration and knowledge. She realized that these things weren't just remnants of the past. They were bridges to the future, opportunities to build something meaningful both for herself and for those she loved. Even the coins, which she had at first glanced at only as financial relief, now carried emotional weight. They weren't simply valuable. They were part of the legacy he had intentionally preserved for her. 2 days later, with the storage unit fully cleared, having paid the small overage fee the staff kindly discounted once they learned the sentimental nature of her discovery, Eleanor drove to meet her daughter. They chose a neutral place, a quiet park lined with old oak trees whose branches created a soft canopy of gold and green. Olivia arrived with her son, a bright-eyed 8-year-old who ran ahead to greet his grandmother with a shy wave that softened Eleanor's heart instantly. The initial conversation with her daughter was delicate, shaped by caution but warmed by genuine willingness. Neither of them rushed. They spoke of simple things first. The weather, the boys' school, the neighbor's dog that always barked at empty air, until gradually, like the slow thaw of winter, deeper things began to surface. When Eleanor finally reached into her bag and handed Olivia the envelope, her daughter froze. At first, Olivia didn't want to open it. The weight of the past pressed too hard against her chest. But after a long silence, she slipped a finger under the seal. As she read, her expression shifted. Confusion, grief, realization, and then an emotion Eleanor recognized instantly. Forgiveness. It wasn't dramatic. No gasp, no tears spilling instantly. It was subtler, like watching the tension in someone's shoulders dissolve after years of carrying a burden they could finally put down. When she looked up, her eyes, though slightly red, held warmth. She stepped closer, hesitated, then finally embraced her mother. It was not the embrace of two people who had solved everything. It was the embrace of two people who had decided to try. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's life took on a new shape, one filled with gentle routines that felt unexpectedly fulfilling. She visited her daughter's home often, sometimes helping her grandson with homework, sometimes sharing tea at the kitchen table while Olivia cooked, sometimes simply sitting together in quiet companionship that had once seemed impossible. They talked about her husband, not with sharp sorrow, but with the soft ache of remembering someone who had loved them both imperfectly but deeply. The grandson loved hearing stories from Eleanor's youth, especially the tales of his grandfather's travels. Slowly, the walls that had stood between mother and daughter began to crumble, not with grand gestures, but with consistent, everyday presence. The artifacts, once hidden in the storage unit, began to find new purpose as well. Eleanor reached out to a local museum, one her husband had admired but never contacted, and offered to donate the rare geological samples and a few of the expedition journals. The curator, stunned by their authenticity and condition, arranged a meeting for a full appraisal and a potential exhibit in his honor. The coins, appraised by an expert familiar with antique collections, turned out to be worth far more than she had imagined, enough to ease her financial worries for the rest of her life and set aside a small fund for her grandson's future. But more than the money, the process of organizing and sharing these items made Eleanor feel connected to her husband in a way she hadn't felt even while he was alive. She finally understood how deeply he had loved his work, and how deeply he had loved her, even if he had not always known how to show it. As spring turned to summer, Eleanor found herself rediscovering parts of herself she thought had been lost with age. She began volunteering once a week at a local community center, organizing reading groups and sharing small lectures about the artifacts and the places her husband had traveled. The stories she told weren't grand or exaggerated, just thoughtful recollections of moments that had shaped their lives. Her voice, once thin with loneliness, now carried a soft confidence, the kind that comes not from performance but from purpose. People listened, really listened, and some even said her talks were the highlight of their week. She had not expected this newfound sense of meaning, but she welcomed it with an open heart. Her daughter noticed the change too. One evening, after walking her to the car, Olivia paused and said, "Mom, I missed you." It was said quietly, but it carried the full truth of everything they had lost and everything they were slowly rebuilding. Eleanor simply nodded, touching her daughter's cheek gently the way she had when Olivia was young. "I'm here now," she said, and for the first time in a long time, she believed it fully. The summer brought one more unexpected gift. The museum finalized plans for a small exhibit dedicated to her husband's life and fieldwork, and they invited Eleanor and her family to attend the opening. Standing in the softly lit gallery, surrounded by the artifacts he had collected and the journals he had written, she felt an overwhelming mixture of pride and peace. Her grandson held her hand, pointing excitedly at the photographs and asking endless questions. Olivia stood beside her, occasionally brushing tears from her eyes, but smiling. The exhibit wasn't grand, but was sincere, an homage to a man who had spent a lifetime exploring the world and who, in his final days, had built one last path for the people he loved. As the evening faded, Eleanor stepped outside into the warm dusk. The city lights shimmered gently across the street, and a breeze brushed past her face, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the fullness of everything she had regained. The family restored, the wounds softened, the sense of purpose renewed. The storage unit, once a simple bed made out of loneliness and distraction, had become a catalyst for healing. It had given her back her daughter, her grandson, and a future she never expected to hold again. And in that quiet, luminous moment, she understood the moral her husband had left behind, woven through every object, every letter, every carefully placed item. That love, even when flawed, can still build bridges. That reconciliation often begins with a single act of courage, and that the past, when finally faced, can illuminate a future brighter than anything she could have imagined. With that understanding warming her heart, Eleanor walked toward her family, ready to begin the next chapter, one she no longer feared, because she no longer faced alone.